But we have the opportunity here to introduce and interview Ambassador John Bolton, who you just heard not too long ago. Ambassador Bolton has made a name for himself in foreign affairs. One would hope, being an ambassador, he would do that and do it well. And Ambassador, thank you and welcome to the Girard at Large radio show.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Glad to. So, Ambassador, we heard a little bit about your bio, and I guess what I would ask you as you consider running for the presidency, because someone with your foreign policy credentials are obviously, I don't know what I want to say, but when you take a look at the country, we obviously know the external threat and external threats that you're very capable of dealing with, very well versed in. What do you think the biggest domestic threats to the country are, and what would your general approach be to those domestic issues?
Well, I consider myself to be a pretty libertarian on domestic economic and fiscal issues, and I think that the deadweight burden that the government has put on the American economy through a variety of mechanisms, excessive taxation, excessive regulation, Obamacare, it's a long list, really have prevented an effective recovery from the recession. And that given the extraordinarily low percentage of the workforce employed, forget the unemployment rate, it's really the percentage of the workforce employed is at historic lows, that the way to get people back to work, the way to get the economy revved up is to eliminate the dead weight of the government.
And as you consider the dead weight of the government, in what areas do you see that burden needs to be lightened? Are there any specific areas that you would address, any particular programs or departments?
Well, I think there's a whole range. I am with those who favor the total repeal of Obamacare. I would go further. I think government interference in the healthcare system over a period of decades really has impaired the delivery of health care, has increased the cost, and therefore, since that cost is passed on through insurance, burdened the economy. I think the tax rates are way too high. I think the regulatory agencies, whether it's the EPA or the National Labor Relations Board or some of the financial regulatory agencies under Dodd-Frank, have gotten far too much power and discretion. And I think we ought to aim to bring domestic spending way down. The president calls any cuts in his budget austerity, but as a radical thought, let's just take the domestic budget back to where it was in 2008. Somehow the country stumbled along with a federal government that was the size it was then. We can do it again, and I think reducing that burden will give us the potential to increase the Defense Department budget, which I think is very necessary to procure new weapon systems and to increase our manpower.
Ambassador, at my left is Sid Glassner. He's a senior fellow with the New England Society for Study of Education, and he's a regular on my show where we discuss public education once a week. He's got some questions for all of the candidates when it comes to their thoughts and ideas on education, and so I'm going to invite him into the conversation.
Well,
great.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Ambassador.
No, it's my pleasure.
And thank you for taking the picture with me. I, as an educator, for many years I visited the UN. In 1948, I guess I had great hopes for the United Nations. That seems to have withered away in my mind throughout the years. I would like to ask you a big question. Do you think the United Nations is a viable entity on the world stage today?
Yeah. Well, I think it still is in some aspects. I know a lot of people are very frustrated with the UN. Some say we should withdraw. One of my distinguished predecessors, Jean Kirkpatrick, was once asked if the U.S. should withdraw from the UN, and she thought a minute, and then she said, no, it's not worth the trouble. and what she meant by that was, once you're in, we have a series of allies who view it as very important. I think the way to handle the UN is to change the budget. To change may sound like a technical change, but instead of mandatory contributions by the United States, they're called assessed contributions, where we pay 22% of the UN budget. We should move to a system where we make voluntary contributions. That is to say, we fund the agencies and the activities that we think do good work. And the corollary is we don't fund the agencies that don't do good work. I think that would be like a tsunami through the halls of the UN. And it would be difficult to get through Congress. But that's the way I would approach it.
Has that kind of suggestion gone anywhere? Have you made it to anyone? Have you had some serious discussions about it?
Well, I proposed it in testimony when I was ambassador to Congress, fully approved by the George W. Bush administration. That approach has been suggested in the bipartisan Gingrich-Mitchell report over 10 years ago. But it's a hard task, and it requires an administration that's willing to tell the UN we're not going to go along with decisions that require us to pay for programs we think are not worth it simply because we're outvoted. But I think once we took that step, many other governments that pay large amounts, Germany, Japan, would do the same. I think we can win with this. I think it's at least worth the effort.
Who has to carry the ball in terms of bringing this forward now?
Well, it's certainly not going to happen in this administration, but I think if there is a new Republican administration in 2017, that's the time to do it. I think there'd be real receptivity to it in Congress. It would require enormous diplomatic effort, as I say, around the world to explain to people why we're going to do it. But otherwise, we just finance many of our enemies in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, the political decision-making bodies of the UN, to attack us and our friends and allies around the world, and we're wasting taxpayer dollars. I mean, for people like me who want to increase defense spending, I think you have to have ways to save money. I've given you some ideas on the domestic side. Here's one on the international side.
Yeah. I think we waste money in a lot of areas, and one of them that I'm familiar with is education and what we're doing there. Do you have any suggestions? Say you were Secretary of Education. What would be the kinds of things that you would like to bring about?
Well, honestly, I would try to work myself out of a job. I mean, I really think that education, like many government services, and education's always going to be in part a government service, I think, best done at the state and local level where parents and local people can have influence over it. When these decisions go to Washington, the people most concerned, the parents, lose control over them. So I'd like to see the revenues stay at the state level, state or local. Each state does it a little bit differently. I'd like to see control over the content kept state and local. And I think this is going to end up with better education, more competitive education. When you get down to the state and local level, I think the idea of charter schools has been a great success. I think the teachers' unions often oppose it, but I think many teachers know, really, teachers who want to see their students improve, they know there are better ways of doing it than what we've got now. And I think at the local level you can have a real debate about it, a real honest debate. In Congress, it just gets lost in the shuffle.
Common Core. I'm going to jump in on this one. Common Core, where are you?
Well,
I want you also to address the idea that the federal government requires, through any means, that states participate in some sort of standardized national or even of their own tests. The way No Child Left Behind did, and now we've got...
No, I don't like that entire concept. And, it's not just in education, if I may say. The federal government for decades has used the prospect of turning money back over to the states to impose standards or requirements on the states that they might not otherwise have chosen. But in whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or a host of other programs, transportation, infrastructure grants, the states look at what in effect is free money to them, and it's a form of coercion. So it's hard for a governor to say, I turned down $25 million just because I wouldn't agree to some hazy standard most people don't pay any attention to. So, I don't disagree with those who say Common Core started out as a good idea. Everybody should learn math in the third grade, but it's obviously gotten well beyond that, and I just don't think it's a federal responsibility primarily.
Ambassador, if people want to learn more about your potential campaign for presidency, or I don't know if you have a think tank or a PAC or something like that, how can they find out more?
Well, I do. I have a PAC and a super PAC that spent over $7.5 million last year to support House and Senate candidates who favor strong national security, and people can go to its website, boltonpac.com. I have a lot of my articles and appearances there, and the full stock of op-eds and articles is at the think tank where I work, the American Enterprise Institute, which is AEI.org.
All right. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us here on the Girard Large Radio Show.
Have you got time for one more question, Ambassador?
Sure. There we go.
So you described yourself as a libertarian conservative, and we just heard Representative Peter King assure us that the NSA is not listening to phone calls and that they have saved us from attacks. What's your position on balancing the country's security with our civil liberties?
Well, I think that's a shorthand that almost everybody would agree with, that you have to balance security with civil liberties. I know what the NSA does. I have benefited as a State Department decision maker from the intelligence they've gathered. I've been out to Fort Meade. I know the people there. They're employees of the Defense Department. And they are devoted to defending the country. And honestly, they don't really care what Americans say to one another. It's hard for people to imagine that they're not important and that NSA really is utterly uninterested in them, but they are, unless they're in conversation with terrorists. And that's what the metadata programs are designed to uncover. If NSA or the FBI want to go further, they're required to get Fourth Amendment search warrants, and in some cases they do, and they get court approval for it. So I think there's been a lot of misinformation about the NSA, and it's in a very difficult position because it can't talk about what it's doing without revealing it to the terrorists. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an asymmetric argument. Critics can say they're doing X and they're doing Y, and it's very hard to demonstrate why that's simply not happening.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We have another speaker coming into the big room that we are going to broadcast as we did for you, and we appreciate your being with us, Ambassador.
Thanks for the opportunity.